Chapter 6, Dietary Energy and Cellular Respiration. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to define ATP and how cells use it to carry out functions, explain how aerobic respiration extracts useful energy from food, and know how fermentation occurs and why. Okay, so this chapter talks about a lot that we talked about in chapter 4 when we talked about nutrition. So it talks about a lot of dietary energy stuff as well, how we're now fighting the sitting disease or obesity, and how that, and it kind of goes into something called NEAT, which I'll let you guys read about that. So we talked about some of that stuff, like how to calculate out your calories from fat and proteins and carbs and all of that. That's talked about a little bit in this chapter, and we discussed it a little bit in chapter 4. So now we're going to get into mostly what respiration is. Okay. So we know that we have to eat food to get energy, and we know that energy means that we have this ability to do work. So how do we actually extract that energy from the food? So inside of the cells, the enzymes break the bonds holding the subunits together. Remember, those are catabolic reactions. These are the ones where we break down the large molecules into smaller ones, and then we release energy. And when we release this energy, it's usually potential chemical energy that's stored in those bonds. And when it's captured and converted into molecular bonds, that can make it that can make up ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, which we'll talk about in just a second. So these are the two metabolic pathways that we discussed before, anabolic and catabolic. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to do a series of reactions that converts that stored food energy into ATP. And the way that we do that is through something called aerobic respiration. Okay, and aerobic means air, right, or oxygen. So to do aerobic respiration, it means that it has to be in the presence of oxygen. Okay. When we do these series of reactions, again, it's basically to form the food into something usable, which is ATP. ATP is our usable energy. So again, it stands for adenosine triphosphate. You don't really need to memorize that, but just so you know it. And what this is kind of likened to, this is the currency of our cells, right? Or the currency really of our whole body. So if you hear about, if you have a gold bar, that's worth a lot of money, right? But you can't just walk into 7-Eleven and buy a bunch of musubis. Before you do that, you have to actually exchange that into a currency that we would regularly use. So you exchange that gold bar for cash, and then you can go buy all the musubis you want. Well, ATP is sort of doing the same thing. When we eat food, we have to break it down through catabolic reactions and then build it back up through anabolic reactions, and actually turn it into some sort of currency that we can use for energy. And that currency is ATP. So ATP is like the cash that we would use on a daily basis, or on all the time throughout the whole day. Everything that you're doing, whether it's you're doing push-ups, you're running around, your cellular functions, all of that is powered by ATP. So that's our cell's currency. That's how we are actually able to get the energy from food. Okay. So this is the equation for aerobic respiration. Take a look at it. These are our inputs over here on the left and our outputs on the right. So these are our reactants. Okay. And these are our products. Does this look familiar? Hopefully it looks familiar. It's the exact opposite of photosynthesis, right? Photosynthesis, we take carbon dioxide, water, and the energy for photosynthesis is our sunlight, and we turn that into glucose and oxygen. And now we're taking that food energy, basically, right? So we've created food from photosynthesis. That's how we fed our plants. And then us as consumers or heterotrophs, we're eating those plants. We're eating our photosynthesizers. So we're taking that glucose, which normally there are other products that you can make from food. Regularly, you hear it referred to as glucose. Glucose is one of the most common ones, and it's one of the easiest ones to kind of explain a lot of these reactions and processes. So we take glucose, and again, if you remember, I said it wasn't super important to know the chemical equation for it, or the chemical makeup of glucose, C6H12O6, but it does make some of this kind of help make a little bit more sense. But now we're taking our products that we have from photosynthesis and they're turning into the reactants in respiration. So we're taking our glucose and our oxygen, and then they're being put out as carbon dioxide and water, which these are actually in respiration our waste products. And then we're getting our energy from it. So this is how our cell, our body are going to do all of the things, all of the work that it needs to do is by taking this energy created from aerobic respiration. Okay, again, glucose is the most common source of energy for all organisms, so you'll hear it mostly referred to as glucose, even if sometimes it's not. For this class, you can consider glucose our source of energy. Okay, so aerobic respiration of glucose, again, glucose and oxygen is going to yield the products of carbon dioxide and water, which are our two waste products, and energy, which is also given off a little bit as heat. Okay, so in aerobic respiration, there are 3 steps. Step 1 is glycolysis. Glycolysis is a little bit unique because we're going through aerobic respiration, right? But glycolysis can actually happen with or without oxygen. Okay, so keep that in mind for a little bit later when we start talking about anaerobic respiration, which is without oxygen. But glycolysis occurs with or without oxygen, and it's happening in the cytoplasm of the cell. So remember, that's kind of the interior aqueous liquid part of the cell. Okay, so we have our glucose molecule here that's being broken down from different food products, and it's in the cytoplasm of the cell. Okay, and again, this is for when we're talking about eukaryotic organisms. Prokaryotic organisms can be a little bit different, but the 3 main stages of aerobic respiration in a eukaryotic cell are pretty much the same, and they all happen in a specific location within the cell and yield distinct products. So make sure that you know each stage of the process of aerobic respiration, where it happens, and what products it yields. So first up, we have glycolysis. And glycolysis is basically taking that glucose or that food and we're breaking it down into glucose, and then we're making it into even smaller molecules in the cell's cytoplasm. So this is again happening, in the cytoplasm. And then once we have the actual products of glycolysis, it is going to release, and this is kind of one of those things where in order to make money, you have to spend money. Same thing here. In order to make energy, we've got to give a little bit of energy or use a little bit of energy. So the ultimate byproduct of glycolysis is we have 2 ATP, and to get those 2 ATP, we're actually using another 2 ATP. So our net yield is 2 ATP, but we're really creating 4 ATP from this because we're getting back the 2 ATP we used before and then doing this. And the other thing that we're making is something called pyruvate. Okay. So we've got 2 ATP molecules and 2 pyruvate molecules. Keep in mind, we need a lot of ATP. So this isn't a huge producer of ATP, but it's kind of getting the whole thing started. Okay, so these 2 pyruvate, the products of glycolysis now are going to go and they're going to find their way to the mitochondria. Okay, now we're getting into step 2. So step 2 is the citric acid cycle. You will also see it commonly referred to as Krebs or Krebs cycle. You probably see it referred to as Krebs cycle more often. It's referred to as citric acid cycle because it is making, or one of the products in this cycle is citric acid. But the guy who discovered this is Krebs, pretty smart guy who figured this whole thing out in like the 30s, I think. So either one, you can call it either one. Know that I'll probably stick to referring to it as citric acid cycle, but I kind of go back and forth too. Okay, so this is step 2. So now we're moving on from glycolysis where we're in the cytoplasm. Now we're moving into the mitochondria. Okay, and that's where we're going to go through our whole Krebs cycle. Okay, So now we're getting into the citric acid cycle, and basically from this, we have a series of reactions, right? And basically what's happening is high energy electrons are being stripped from the bonds between the carbon atoms, so between carbon to carbon, and they're being carried to the inner membranes of the mitochondria. So again, during this process, we're only making a small amount of ATP, 2 ATP. And I forgot to mention in glycolysis, we have our 2-pyruvate. We're also making something called NADH. And I believe we have 2 there as well. Not as important to know as the pyruvate and the ATP. Okay. So in the citric acid cycle, it's a whole cycle. And when we talk about these 3 steps of aerobic respiration, keep in mind, we're talking about it like glycolysis happens first and then we go to citric acid cycle, but really all of these are kind of happening at the same time. But they're going in phases to some extent. And if we were to see it, if it had to go only one time, this is the order it should go in, right? So we go through glycolysis first, and then we get into the citric acid cycle where it's just constantly cycling, but it's taking these NADH plus molecules, and it's also making more NADH plus and also FAD. Okay. And a byproduct of the citric acid cycle is actually carbon dioxide. So the carbon atoms that are released from that chemical bond of the food join with oxygen to form carbon dioxide, and that we actually exhale from our lungs. So you're constantly exhaling products of the citric acid cycle. Step 3, our last one, again, this has to happen in the presence of oxygen. This is the electron transport chain. So you'll see this commonly referred to as ETC as well, if you see it abbreviated. This is our big money maker. So this is what's going to make all the ATP. Not all of it. We've already made 4 ATP, 2 in glycolysis and 2 in Krebs. Now we're going to be making a lot more. Okay. So in electron transport chain, what happens is as those high energy electrons are passed down a chain of molecules, they power a series of reactions that channel energy into the formation of many ATP molecules. So we have all of that NADH plus and FAD plus too, or not FAD plus, just FAD, and we could do FADH too. That came from before, right? And basically these electrons, we're transferring hydrogen kind of down the chain. So all this hydrogen is just being passed down, and every time it's making ATP when it's going through this, and it's powering an enzyme called ATP synthase. That's like our big money maker in this, basically. So all of these high energy electrons are being passed down the chain of molecules, and every time it's passed down, it's creating an ATP. So it does this 36 times. And at the end, this little hydrogen is thrown off as a byproduct, and it's combining with oxygen molecules, right? The oxygen molecules accept the transported electrons. They join with this hydrogen, and now we have water as a byproduct. So again, water is kind of our byproduct of the electron transport chain, and it's also another waste product. Okay. I know that this is kind of all a little bit hard to visualize. Normally I show you guys a few videos, which I'll talk about at the end of class, or at the end of this lecture, but I will also post YouTube videos that I think are helpful. You guys can feel free to look for other YouTube videos and animations of this. I think it's really helpful to watch them. Just be careful. This is a fairly short lecture on this process of aerobic respiration, but you could spend hours, days just talking about each step of this. Glycolysis would take so long to actually understand the whole process and all of the products and reactants in it. So when you're watching these animations, kind of take the stuff that you've heard from me and focus on that, because you guys don't need to know lots of the nitty-gritty stuff. You'll hear about acetyl-CoA, different enzymes that are in citric acid cycle. Those are important, but they're not something that you necessarily need to know or understand for this course. Okay, so what about fatty acids, right? Because we had glucose that we went through and did this with, and glucose is usually being broken down from different carbs, right? But we also have fats are being broken down in proteins, so fatty acids and amino acids, are also converted to ATP. So they basically go through the exact same cycle that our glucose did. So even the energy that you're getting from different macronutrients, it's going through the exact same thing. We just tend to talk about glucose the most. Okay, so we talked about aerobic respiration. That's in a perfect world if we have oxygen. And I will give a little disclaimer. So sorry, I can't go back, but we have 2 ATP from glycolysis plus 2 ATP from Krebs or citric acid cycle, and then we have 36 ATP from electron transport chain. So all in all, this yields about 40 ATP. Keep in mind, a lot of the videos you watch will say 38 ATP. Most of the time, they'll say there's only 34 ATP in electron transport chain. For our purposes in this class, we're going to go with 40 are yielded from one glucose molecule. So you can imagine there's as many glucose molecules as you're consuming, you're producing lots and lots of ATP throughout the day too, but you're also using lots of ATP. So keep in mind that we're going to go with this number here. So even though you'll see these numbers in some of the videos, just remember what our numbers say in lecture and in the reading. We'll stick with 40 ATP. Also keep in mind that's like a perfect world. Everything's going perfectly. Really, things don't go that perfectly in your body, even if you're like the epitome of health. So we're probably realistically making somewhere closer to like 30 to 35 ATP for each glucose molecule, just because it's not 100% efficient. But in the perfect world, we're yielding about 40 ATP through aerobic respiration. But what happens when oxygen is scarce? Okay, so now we don't have oxygen, or in our case, like let's say we're exercising, sometimes the oxygen consumption exceeds the oxygen intake, which means that electron transport chain has no oxygen to receive electrons. Remember all of those H pluses as they're making their way down the chain, and then they combine with the oxygen to produce H2O as a byproduct. So if there's no oxygen, it means electron transport chain can't work. Krebs cycle also needs oxygen to combine with that CO2, right, to be exhaled throughout our lungs. So again, anaerobic respiration is what we call basically the same process, but now we don't have oxygen. So anaerobic respiration is the exact same thing as fermentation. And I'm sure you've heard of fermentation before, and that's what's happening when oxygen is scarce. Okay, so this is like how you create alcohol, right? Or how you create certain bacteria. So these are the kind of things that you can do through fermentation, and it means that you have no oxygen. Again, glycolysis happens with or without oxygen. So fermentation is basically going through glycolysis. It's just going through it a little bit differently. So it's going through it the same way in that it happens, we break down our food, we're breaking it down into glucose, and then from glucose, we're getting oxygen. Oxygen is coming from the blood, okay? Because if you remember our inputs or our products, we have glucose and oxygen. So glucose coming from the food, oxygen coming from the blood. That's with or without oxygen. We're doing aerobic or anaerobic respiration. We're getting oxygen from the blood, glucose from the food, okay? So glycolysis happens the same way whether or not it has oxygen. But now, if it doesn't have oxygen, it's going through something called fermentation. And fermentation basically is converting the products of glycolysis into lactic acid or alcohol, which then leaves the cell. Okay, so if you remember in glycolysis and aerobic respiration, we produce pyruvate and ATP. We're still doing that. We're still producing 2 ATP, okay? But it's the only ATP that is produced in fermentation, so we're not producing very much. So when you're exercising and you don't have oxygen, we're switching into fermentation because you don't have oxygen. And basically what fermentation is doing is it's replenishing cofactors. And cofactors in this case are things like your NAD plus and your FAD, right? So that's normally what would come out of glycolysis if we had it in the presence of oxygen and aerobic respiration. But in anaerobic respiration, we can't just keep making pyruvate. We have to switch to lactic acid in order to replenish those enzyme cofactors like NAD+ that need to be used later on in the electron transport chain. Okay, so that's the reason why we switch to fermentation. And fermentation depends, so you can either produce lactic acid if you're like a human, or it could produce alcohol. So if you think about yeast, right? If we're going to make beer or wine, for those of you who are over 21, yeast, when they go through fermentation, actually produce an alcohol. Luckily, we don't. If we produced alcohol, it would be like we were drunk all the time, that we were breaking a sweat or going to the gym. So we produce lactic acid. You guys have probably heard of lactic acid before. Lactic acid is basically why the reason after you work out really hard, your muscles feel really sore, because you've got this whole buildup of lactic acid that you've kind of got to break up and go through lots and lots of aerobic respiration after you go through this bout of anaerobic respiration while you're exercising. So now that we've gone through aerobic and anaerobic respiration, it should kind of occur to you, right, that photosynthesis and aerobic respiration form this awesome, perfect cycle, right? It's just a continuous loop. So the outputs of one process serve as the inputs of the other, right? So we've got carbon dioxide being produced during respiration. So carbon dioxide is coming, again, it's being exhaled through our lungs through the citric acid cycle. And plants and algae are using that. They're taking that in to produce glucose and oxygen, right, during photosynthesis. And then with that from photosynthesis, they yield a glucose molecule and oxygen. And from those in photosynthesis, those are used by plants and animals that eat the plants, and nearly all living things to make ATP during aerobic respiration. So then we go through aerobic respiration again, we exhale more CO2, and it just goes back and forth all of the time. Again, I know this is kind of hard to follow along. This is one of the videos I recommend. It's a crash course video. The guy on it, if you haven't watched crash course videos before, is kind of annoying, but he does a really good job of explaining everything. So I highly recommend this. I'll put up another one as well that might be kind of helpful, and you guys are welcome to watch other animations too. Again, just be careful. Don't get too wrapped up in anything too complicated. I mostly want you guys to know that aerobic respiration goes through glycolysis, which produces 2-pyruvate, 2 NADH+, and 2-pyruvate, and 2 ATP. And then we go into citric acid cycle, which is also referred to as Krebs cycle. We're still producing 2 ATP, and then quite a few more actually, NADH+ and FAD. And we're exhaling CO2 through the lungs. And at the very end, electron transport chain through ATP synthase, we're producing lots and lots of ATP, about 36 ATP for a total of 40 ATP from one glucose molecule through the whole process of aerobic respiration. I know that's a lot. You might have to listen to this once or twice, but I highly recommend the videos, because I think watching it as an animation of what's actually going on through the cell will help a little bit more, and I'm not as good at drawing as some of these folks are.